Because I'd like questions as well and comments from the audience. Last but not the least, I really appreciated seeing this chapter in this book because oftentimes people who do environmental policy, and I must say I come at this from a policy perspective, like Tony Abbate, who was up here before. He's from architecture. I am from public administration, and my background is a political scientist who studies public policy and public management issues. So I come at it from that perspective. And oftentimes when people are studying environmental policy issues, they don't make the link to disaster management and disaster policy. And I was very glad to see this chapter here and the link to that. And the authors of this chapter are Robert Dale, Timothy Chapin, and Earl Baker. And they present a much-needed evaluation of the extent to which hazard mitigation planning mandates have helped manage growth and development in coastal high-hazard areas and within hurricane evacuation zones. Earlier speakers have mentioned the fact that there was a strong coastal management element within the GMA, that itself was unique, I think, at the time it was done, and it was, and as been mentioned earlier, Florida is a forerunner in terms of planning innovation. To make that part mandatory has led to several implications for disaster management policy within these areas. So I'm going to take just briefly summarize the main points of this chapter, and then relate the findings in this chapter to disaster management policy and to policy issues in general, and then just make some points about disaster management and growth management as it relates to Florida and around the country. So to begin with, the authors begin by describing, the Florida growth management legislation, which mandated the local comprehensive plans to include policies to limit development in and direct populations away from the coastal high hazard areas, as well as to maintain or reduce evacuation clearance times within hurricane vulnerability zones. And these, given that we see this all over the country, where we see a large proportion, or a large percentage of folks increasingly moving to the coast, densities increasing on coastlines, which basically puts more people and property at risk. And we've got good at moving people away, but not so much protecting property. So given that, the idea of using some kind of mandatory planning in local comprehensive plans, where local governments were supposed to comply with a number of provisions, such as inventory existing, proposed land uses in CC in these coastal high hazard areas, doing an evaluation of structures that are repetitively damaged by coastal storms, trying to direct population concentrations away from this area, trying to limit development in this area. And so this is an evaluation of that. How local governments have succeeded or not succeeded in doing that. The researchers since they don't look at all the coastal communities in the state. They take a sample and look at 89 jurisdictions. And with these 89 jurisdictions, they include 15 counties and 74 municipalities. And some of the research questions are basically to try and do a before and after comparison. Is to try and see, okay, after the growth management legislation was passed in 1985, and after the use of local comprehensive plans were mandated and approved by the DCA, what happened? Did residential land use policies change after plan approval? What was the change before and after? Did land use change within both the CCHAs and the CHHAs, the coastal high hazard areas, as well as hurricane vulnerability zones? Did exposure to hurricane flooding lessen because of this legislation and the provisions of this legislation? Did population exposure, to such flooding, as well as shelter deficits, shelter demand deficits, increase or decrease after this legislation was passed? And they undertake a fairly careful evaluation of these questions by looking at the sample of these jurisdictions, and then try to extrapolate from these jurisdictions to the rest of the state. They present a number of tables in the chapter, which I think are very useful, a lot of data in looking at this, and along with maps in terms of showing which these areas are, as well as the effect of this legislation on and the percentage changes within the coastal high hazard areas and within hurricane vulnerability zones as well, to see how the growth rates changed prior to plan approval and after plan approval. They look at various things such as the growth density. They look at the number of residential units, the value of residential structures, the implements and shelter demand that would increase, whether growth management helped or not with respect to that, as well as the evacuation clearance times, within hurricane vulnerability zones, to see if that was impacted as well. Like the other finding, and they find that yes, there was to some extent a positive impact of growth management legislation and provisions. There was low residential growth within the coastal high hazard areas, both prior to and after comprehensive plan approval and implementation. So to some extent, growth was slowed down. However, when you take into account, which they did very carefully, the vacant land supply, then you did have, in fact, higher growth densities within the coastal high hazard areas and within hurricane vulnerability zones. So, again, a mixed blessing there. And also, as Timothy mentioned earlier, with respect to raw numbers, when you look at the raw numbers, just because comparatively the numbers look better, that doesn't mean it was all good, because when you look at the raw numbers again, the raw numbers showed substantial increase in residential exposure, which, living in Florida for the past 10 years even, one could see that right off the bat, where you see just an increased number of development along the coast, where you see a tremendous growth in just the vulnerability that is increasing as with the development, and so yes, there is this mixed blessing again of this impact really in terms of the evaluation. If you're trying to evaluate what impact these planning policies have had in disaster management and trying to reduce vulnerability and exposure to hurricane flooding, I would have liked to see some sort of multivariate analysis done where you have the impact of this factor as well as other factors such as just simple obviously population growth change, but also other issues such as the building code enforcement legislation, what impact that has in reducing vulnerability, the level of social vulnerability, etc., which would also impact hurricane evacuation clearance times in trying to do that. So just a sort of using a multivariate analysis of different factors to try and determine the effectiveness of planning mandates itself, and trying to look at an evaluation of whether these mandates play a role in actually reducing or helping in terms of disaster policy. And that a couple of last points with respect to the chapter is in terms of working on or looking at other problems that make disaster policy difficult. The safe development paradox is one of the issues, but the political incentives basically that exist to create unsafe policies, where you have political figures who are there for the short run, they're there to serve the electorate and serve the electorate's pleasure, the pressure to dispense subsidies, the pressure to respond with aid to disasters, all creating this general expectation, that the government is going to step in should disaster strike, and reducing individual responsibility and local government responsibility in some cases to do more, to take more steps. So just taking some of those things as well into account in trying to understand or evaluate growth management legislation. And finally, and this stems from a project that I'm working on with, again, some of the planning faculty, in terms of looking at growth management legislation. I guess one of